The billionaire faked a coma to catch his family's lies, but the night nurse's secret broke him first. The fall happened on a Wednesday afternoon in October. On a staircase Edward Marsh had descended 10,000 times without once looking at his feet. He was always moving fast. It was the operating principle of 63 years, the engine behind everything he had built. The reason the city outside his office window looked the way it did, instead of the way it had looked when he arrived as a young man with a briefcase and an appetite that embarrassed him in retrospect, only because it had been so naked. He had wanted everything and he had gotten most of it, and the cost of that had been a velocity that never quite allowed him to stop and ask whether the direction was right. He had been moving toward the staircase because 20 minutes earlier, on the screen of his son's computer, Nathan had left his office unlocked, which was either carelessness or arrogance, and with Nathan those two things had always been difficult to tell apart. Edward had seen a contract. A subcontract, technically, signed 6 weeks ago. A construction firm, with no current safety certification, no valid liability insurance, and an address that traced back to a shell company registered in a state where Nathan had no known business connections. The project was a highway bridge currently under construction 40 miles outside the city. The contract value was significant enough that a signature from Edward's level should have been required. Nathan had signed it himself, using a subsidiary authorization clause that technically permitted it and practically should never have been used for anything of this size. Edward had closed the laptop, walked to the staircase, and somewhere between the third and second floor, his left foot found a patch of floor that the cleaning crew had treated that morning and not yet finished drying, and the velocity that had carried him for 63 years became the thing that ended his afternoon. He did not lose consciousness immediately. He remembered the ceiling, the recessed lighting, the fire suppression heads, the architectural details of a building he had commissioned himself tilting sideways and then away. He remembered thinking, with the last organized thought before the impact, that he had not yet decided what to do about what he had seen on Nathan's screen. Then the floor arrived, and thinking stopped. He woke in a room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, in a bed whose mechanical adjustability he recognized as the model his company had specified for the VIP floor of Callaway Regional Medical Center, a hospital that occupied land his company had cleared, in a building his company had built, in a city that bore his fingerprints on every significant structure erected in the past 2 decades. The light was white and flat. An IV line ran into his left forearm. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm that felt managed rather than spontaneous. He tried to lift his right hand. Nothing happened. He tried to speak. His throat produced a sound that did not reach the level of a word. He tried to open his eyes fully and managed it for approximately 2 seconds before the effort produced a pain behind his temples that instructed him, with considerable force, to stop. He stopped. He lay still. And in the stillness, he heard a voice outside the door. A physician speaking to a colleague, the register of medical professionals communicating efficiently. Receptive language function undetermined. We'll need another 48 hours before we can assess comprehension. Edward heard this clearly. He understood every word. He processed the information with the same speed he had always processed information, and in the space of perhaps 10 seconds he understood what it meant and what it made possible. If the physicians did not know he could hear and understand, the people who came into this room would not know either. He closed his eyes completely. He steadied his breathing. He had spent 40 years across tables from people who were not telling him everything, and he had learned that the most powerful position in any room was the one that knew more than it revealed. He would do this from a hospital bed. He did not examine whether this was wise. He made the decision the way he had made every significant decision in his adult life quickly, from instinct, without waiting for permission from himself. Nathan arrived at 4:15 in the afternoon. Edward heard him before the door opened, the cadence of his son's footsteps, efficient and deliberate, the walk of a man who had modeled himself on his father so precisely that he had eliminated everything that might have distinguished him from that model. Edward had considered this a success for most of Nathan's adult life. He was no longer certain what he considered it. Stuart Greer came in with him. Edward had hired Stuart 9 years ago because the man was meticulous and loyal and asked only the questions he already knew the answer to. These qualities, which had seemed like assets, were reframing themselves in Edward's mind as he lay still and listened. A nurse checked the monitors, adjusted the IV drip, asked Nathan a question about Edward's emergency contact information. Nathan answered with appropriate concern, appropriate warmth, the full performance of a worried son. The nurse left. The door clicked shut. "The incapacitation clause activates at 72 hours, Nathan said. His voice had changed, not dramatically, but the layer that existed for other people's benefit was gone. What remained was the operational core. "We're at 38. The board will need formal notification," Stewart said. "Schedule it for Thursday. Quorum +2. Conference line for the Denver members." A pause. The sound of Nathan moving, closer to the bed. "He never trusted me enough to transfer authority while he was conscious. He always needed to be the one holding the pen." Edward lay still. "Now," Nathan said, and his voice carried something Edward had never allowed himself to hear before: the specific absence of grief, the presence of something adjacent to satisfaction. "That changes." Edward catalogued the sentence. Not the meaning, which was clear, but the texture of it. He had taught Nathan to read a room, to find the leverage in every situation, to keep emotion out of calculation. He was hearing the result of that education applied to himself. He did not move. He waited. Claudia arrived at 7:40 in the evening without calling ahead. Edward knew it was her before she reached the door because he heard her voice in the hallway, a brief exchange with the charge nurse, carrying the quality it had always carried, a directness that had nothing to do with hostility, and everything to do with the fact that she did not see the point of approaching things sideways when forward was available. She came in, set something down on the chair near the window, and stood at the foot of the bed for a moment. Edward heard her breathing adjust, the slight change that indicates a person absorbing something difficult. Then she sat down. She reached forward and placed her hand over his right hand, the one that would not move, on top of the blanket. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply sat there with her hand over his, and Edward, who had spent 63 years treating stillness as a tactical position, felt the stillness of the room change quality in a way he did not have language for. He tried to remember the last time Claudia had held his hand. He could not. She had been 3 years old when he and Margaret had brought her home. Margaret had chosen her, had seen her photograph in an agency folder and said, with the certainty Margaret applied to everything she loved, that this was their daughter. Edward had agreed because Margaret was almost always right, and because the look on his wife's face when she said it was the kind of look that made agreement feel like the only reasonable response. After Margaret died, Edward had continued to provide for Claudia with the same efficiency he applied to all his obligations. She had gone to good schools. She had wanted for nothing material. He had attended her undergraduate graduation and missed the graduate ceremony for a contract signing he had, at the time, considered more important. She had grown into a person he respected enormously and understood almost not at all. She worked in environmental planning in Portland. She had stopped asking him questions years ago, not because she had lost interest in the answers, he understood now, but because she had learned the answers were not going to come. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she squeezed his hand once and said quietly, to the room rather than to him, "I flew across the country. I'm not leaving until you're awake." The door closed. Edward lay in the silence and thought about what it meant that the person who had traveled farthest to be in this room was the one he had consistently made feel farthest from its center. Beverly Odoms began her shift at 11 p.m. Edward heard the ward change the shift in ambient sound that marked the transition between day staff and night staff, the decrease in foot traffic, the different register of conversations in the hallway. He had been awake for approximately 7 hours by then and had already heard 2 more conversations between Nathan and Stuart Greer, a call from a board member whose name he recognized, and a brief visit from his personal physician. The door opened, a different quality of motion, not the brisk efficiency of the day staff, but the measured pace of someone who had learned long ago that the night shift in a neurological ward required a different relationship with time. A cart, equipment set down on a surface. The smell of the cleaning solution his company had specified for this floor, because he had reviewed the supply contracts himself, years ago, because he reviewed everything. He heard her check his vitals, record something, Adjust the IV line with the practiced minimal motion of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. Then she stopped. He felt her presence shift from clinical to something else, something harder to categorize. The quality of attention in the room changed. He was aware of being looked at in a way that was different from being examined. When she spoke, it was not to him. It was the voice of someone who has developed, over years, the habit of speaking to a specific absence, filling a silence that will never be answered, because the act of speaking matters more than the response. "My son worked for you when he was 29 years old," she said. Her voice was level, steady, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this not as a speech, but as a fact she needed to keep saying out loud. "He died on one of your job sites when he was 31. The investigation report said accidental technical failure." A pause. "I have never believed that report." Edward did not move. "I'm not here because of anger," she continued. "Anger doesn't pay the electric bill. I'm here because this is my job, and I have done this job correctly for 21 years regardless of what else was happening in my life." Another pause, longer, waited with something he could not yet identify. "And I'm here because I needed to be in the same room as someone who might know the truth, even if that person can't hear me." She picked up her cart, moved toward the door. "My son's name was Deshaun," she said. "Deshaun Odoms. He was a structural engineer. He could explain anything with a pencil and a piece of paper." The door opened. He deserved better than a one-paragraph finding and a closed file. The door closed. Edward Marsh lay in the dark, in a hospital he had built, in a city he had shaped, unable to move a single voluntary muscle, and understood, for the first time in a very long time, that he did not know which side of the truth he was on. He did not sleep that night. He spent it trying to remember the name of a structural engineer, 31 years old, who had died on one of his job sites 7 years ago. He could not find it in his memory. It had never been there. That, he understood by the time the first gray light appeared around the edges of the window blinds, was the whole problem. Beverly came back the following night, and the night after that. Edward spent the intervening hours cataloging what he knew and what he did not know, the way he had always approached problems larger than the information currently available, systematically, without forcing conclusions, building the structure of what was certain before attempting to fill in what was not. What was certain: Deshaun Odoms had died on one of his job sites 7 years ago. The investigation had concluded accidental technical failure. Frank Dillard, his director of internal legal affairs, had handled the file and reported to Edward that everything had been resolved appropriately. Edward had accepted that report and returned his attention to the federal infrastructure contract that had been, at the time, the largest in the company's history. What was not certain, whether Frank's resolution had been what it appeared to be. Nathan came in the mornings. He had established a routine early enough to speak with the physicians before rounds, late enough to claim he had not disrupted his schedule. He brought Stuart Greer every other day and spoke with appropriate concern to the nursing staff and with operational precision to his lawyer when the door was closed. On the second morning, Edward heard Nathan on the phone with a board member named Harrington, a man Edward had known for 16 years and trusted to be reliably self-interested, which was a more durable quality than loyalty. Nathan was explaining, carefully, that Edward's prognosis was uncertain and that the company needed to be prepared for continuity planning. Harrington asked how long. Nathan said he expected clarity within the week. On the third morning, Stuart arrived with a folder. He and Nathan reviewed its contents near the window. Edward caught enough. A secondary authorization clause. A timeline. A notary who apparently made house calls to medical facilities. By the end of the third day, Edward had also learned that Nathan had appointed a new operational director named Dennis Farrell, a man whose name had come up twice in phone conversations between Nathan and Stuart, described as someone who would streamline the management structure once the transition was complete. Edward filed this information alongside the rest. The structure of what Nathan intended was becoming cleaner by the hour. What Edward had not anticipated, what he could not have calculated from outside this room, was Claudia. She came every afternoon and stayed until visiting hours ended. She did not make calls from the room or review documents. She sat with a book she rarely seemed to actually read, and periodically she spoke, not the way Beverly spoke, to an absence, but more tentatively, as if she were testing whether the channel was open. On the second afternoon, she said, "I've been thinking about Mom a lot this week, about the way she used to describe you before you were successful. She said you were the same person, just louder about it later." Edward turned this over for a long time after she left. On the third afternoon, she said, "Nathan called me last night. He told me I should go back to Portland. He said there was nothing I could do here, and it would be better for everyone if I let the family handle it." A long pause. "I told him I was part of the family." She was quiet for a moment. "He didn't say anything to that. I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know I'm not going anywhere, not because of the company or the estate or any of that. Just because you're my father and I haven't finished being angry at you yet, and I need you to be awake for that conversation." Edward lay still and felt the specific weight of being accurately described by someone he had underestimated. Beverly came at 11, and she brought Deshawn with her in pieces. She did not tell the story sequentially. She told it the way memory actually works, not as a narrative with a beginning and an end, but as a collection of moments that surface in whatever order they arrive. The second night, she talked about Deshawn's laugh. She said it was the kind of laugh that happened before the joke was finished, because he could see where things were going and could not wait. She said she used to tell him to let people finish their sentences, and he would say he was saving time. She said she had not heard anyone laugh that way since. Edward lay in the dark and thought about whether he had ever noticed how the people who worked for him laughed. He could not recall a single instance of having paid attention to that. The third night, she talked about the notebook. Deshawn had kept a field notebook, spiral-bound, water-resistant covers, the kind engineers used on active sites. He had filled 3 of them by the time he died. Beverly still had them. She had read them several times in the years since, not for the technical content, but because his handwriting was in them, and his margin notes, and occasionally small drawings not of structures, but of things he saw on sites, a hawk on a beam, a pattern in the gravel, a child's drawing someone had taped to a temporary wall. He noticed things, Beverly said, not just the structural things, everything. He used to say an engineer who only looks at the steel is going to miss what the steel is telling him. She paused. The last notebook has an entry from 3 days before he died. He wrote that something was wrong with the temporary support configuration on the east section. He had flagged it to his site supervisor. The supervisor told him the sign-off had already come from the main office and to keep moving. She was quiet for a moment. The east section is where he was when the scaffolding came down. Edward heard this and felt something cold settle in the center of his chest. He had not known about a notebook. He had not known there was a final entry. He had not known Deshawn Odoms had flagged a concern 3 days before his death and been told the main office had already approved the configuration. He had not known because he had not asked. He had not asked because Frank Dillard had told him everything had been resolved appropriately, and Edward had believed him, because Edward had built a system where the right people handled the right problems and reported to him only what required his level of attention. He had built the system. He had decided what required his attention. Deshawn Odoms had not made the cut. The fourth night, Beverly reached into the pocket of her scrubs. Edward heard the slight change in the quality of her presence, the shift that happens when a person picks up something that carries weight beyond its physical mass. Then stillness. When she spoke, her voice changed completely. It was no longer the voice she used to speak to the room. It was the voice of a mother talking to her child direct, without performance, carrying the intimacy of a relationship that death had interrupted, but not ended. Deshawn. She said his name the way you say the name of someone you are certain is listening. Today, I found another piece. I know the name now. I've known it for 3 weeks, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with it, whether to go to a lawyer, whether to go to the press, whether it even matters anymore after 7 years. A silence. It matters, she said. And in those 2 words, Edward heard 7 years compressed every night she had come to work in this building. Every morning, she had gone home to an apartment that contained 3 field notebooks and a photograph and a silence that did not get quieter with time. She put the photograph away. His name is Frank Dillard, she said. He was the director of internal legal affairs for Marsh Construction. He signed the order that removed the original safety assessment from the investigation file. Not the whole file, just the assessment. The one that would have shown the main office approved a support configuration that 3 engineers, including my son, had flagged as insufficient. A pause. He removed it 6 weeks before the federal contract was signed. The contract that would have been jeopardized by an active negligence investigation. She moved toward the door. I don't know if his boss knew, she said. I have spent 7 years not knowing that. I still don't know it tonight. The door opened. But I know the name, she said, and I know what Deshawn would have wanted me to do with it. The door closed. Edward lay in the room built to his specifications, under the silence that settles over a neurological ward after midnight, and he asked himself the question he had spent his career avoiding. Had he known? Not about the notebook, not about the 3 engineers who had flagged the east section, not about the specific document Frank Dillard had removed from the file. Those things, he was now confident, he had genuinely not known. But had he created a system in which not knowing was the point? He thought about the federal contract, about the timeline, about the fact that Frank Dillard had been with him for 20 years and had never once brought him a problem that could not be managed, which was the quality Edward had valued above all others, and which he understood now was a description of a vacation who had learned to manage problems in ways that did not require Edward's knowledge or consent. He thought about the word resolution. Frank had used it. Everything has been resolved appropriately. Edward had never asked what resolution meant in that context. He had assumed it meant, the matter is closed, the family is compensated, the company is protected. He had never asked what it cost. He had never asked who paid the cost. Deshawn Odoms had died at 31 years old. His mother had spent 7 years working night shifts in the building Edward had built, carrying a photograph in her pocket and a name she had finally found. Edward had been in this room for 4 days and had still been processing it as a problem to be managed rather than a life that had been lost. He lay still in the dark. He had a great deal of catching up to do. On the 5th morning, Nathan and Claudia found each other in the hallway. Edward heard it through the door, not every word, but enough. Nathan's voice, controlled and low. There's no reason for you to still be here. The legal situation is straightforward. Claudia's voice, level. I'm not here for the legal situation. You don't have standing to contest the authorization transfer. You're not named in the original documents. I know what I'm not named in. A beat. I know exactly what I'm not named in. And I know why. And I have made my peace with it. What I have not made my peace with is you counting days in the hallway of your father's hospital room. A silence. Footsteps. A door down the hall. Claudia came in and sat down and picked up her book and did not say anything for a long time. Eventually she said, quietly, I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know that I'm not here because of anything you built. I'm here because of something Mom saw in you that I've been trying to find for 30 years. I'd like to find it before one of us runs out of time. Edward lay still. He had made many decisions in his life that he understood to be correct. He had made some that he understood, in retrospect, to be wrong. But the decisions that had cost the most were not any of those. They were the decisions he had made without realizing he was making them, the accumulation of choices, to not ask, to not look, to trust that the right people were handling the right things. The invisible architecture of omission that had seemed, from inside it, like efficiency. From outside it, in a hospital bed, it looked like something else entirely. The crisis arrived on 2 fronts simultaneously, the way the worst things usually do. Edward heard the second front at 7:40 in the morning. A different voice in the hallway, administrative, the register of someone delivering news that falls within their job description but not within their comfort level. Edward caught the words through the door in fragments. Restructuring, night shift coverage, 14 days, effective immediately. Then Beverly's voice, brief, steady, asking a single question, is this connected to the new operational director's review? The administrative voice said it was a hospital-wide staffing adjustment. Beverly said she understood. The conversation ended. Edward assembled what he had just heard. Dennis Farrell, the operational director Nathan had installed earlier that week, had conducted a staffing review within his first days on the job. Beverly Odoms, 21 years on this floor, had received a termination notice. Deshawn had died on a job site Edward owned. Now Beverly was losing her position in a hospital Edward had built, under a director Nathan had installed. During the same week, Nathan was finalizing the transfer of Edward's authority. 2 generations, 1 mechanism. Beverly came in for what she did not know might be one of her last shifts on this floor. She worked with the same precision she always brought, moving through the room with the economy of motion built across 2 decades. She checked his vitals. She recorded her findings. She adjusted the IV line. Then, she stopped at the foot of the bed. "I got a notice this morning," she said. To the room, to Deshawn, to whatever she spoke to in this way. 21 years, 1 page, a pause that had no performance in it, just a person absorbing something confirmed rather than feared. "I'm not surprised. Some part of me has been waiting for something like this since I started asking questions." She was quiet for a moment. "Deshawn, I want you to know that I am not angry. I thought I would be, but mostly I am just tired of the way things work." A pause. Not tired enough to stop, just tired. She picked up her cart. "I told my nephew Andre last week that I thought I was close to something. He asked me what I was going to do when I got there." She moved toward the door. "I told him I'd figure that out when it happened." The door handle. Edward had been gathering himself for 5 nights building toward this moment without naming it, accumulating the readiness that is not courage exactly, but is what remains when every alternative has been examined and found insufficient. He had one word he needed to say before she left. He found it in the same place he had always found what he needed, not in calculation, not in strategy, but in the part of himself that acted before the rest of him had finished deciding. "Odoms." The word came out rough and fractured, the voice of someone who had not used his throat in 6 days. But it came out. Beverly stopped. The door did not close. She did not move for a long moment, a stillness so complete that Edward could hear the ambient sounds of the ward filling the space around it. The distant beeping of a monitor, the soft footsteps of someone in the hallway, the low hum of the building itself. Then, slowly, she turned. He could not see her face clearly. His vision was still blurred from days of disuse, the room slightly overlit in the way hospital rooms always are. But he could see enough. He could see that she was standing in the doorway with her cart and her 21 years and her photograph in her pocket, looking at a man who had just said her name for the first time. The silence between them lasted long enough to carry weight. "You've been awake," she said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was the statement of a woman who had spent 7 years learning to identify what was true and what was constructed to look like truth, and who had just identified something clearly. "How long?" she asked. Edward held up his left hand and extended 5 fingers. 5 nights. Beverly looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. The silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of the specific gravity of everything that had been said in this room over those 5 nights. Everything he had heard and she had not known he was hearing, the enormous weight of it now made visible. Then she nodded once, slow, deliberate, the nod of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a specific thing and is watching it happen and has not yet decided whether to believe it is real. Edward said, pushing each word out with the effort of someone lifting something heavier than it appeared. "Frank Dillard, I will not let it stay buried." Beverly stood in the doorway. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that Claudia, who had been asleep in the chair, stirred slightly, long enough that somewhere down the hall, a monitor changed its rhythm and changed back. Then she said, "Then I'll get the doctor." She put her cart down in the hallway. She did not run. She walked the same measured pace she had walked every night on this floor for 21 years, because Beverly Odoms did not run toward things any more than she ran away from them. She got the doctor. What followed was not dramatic in the way certain moments look dramatic in retrospect. Dr. James Whitmore, the attending neurologist, arrived within 4 minutes and conducted a responsiveness assessment that took another 12. He formally documented Edward Marsh as conscious, comprehending, and communicating, which voided the incapacitation determination and rendered Stuart Greer's authorization transfer legally inoperative, effective immediately. Nathan was in the building. He was notified at 7:58 in the morning that his father was awake. Edward asked for 2 things, a notepad and Claudia. Claudia arrived still in the clothes she had slept in, which meant she had been in the building overnight. She had arranged with the nursing staff to sleep in the family waiting room 2 floors down, which Edward had not known because no one had mentioned it and he had not been in a position to ask. She came in and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at him. He looked at her. He tried to find the words for what he wanted to say, something that would carry the weight of 34 years of looking at her through the wrong kind of glass, the transactional lens he had applied to everyone in his life, until he had understood, over 5 sleepless nights, what that lens had cost. He could not find the right words. His voice was not yet capable of the sentence he needed, so he did the thing he had not done since she was small enough to be carried. He reached out his left hand and held it open. Claudia looked at his hand. She crossed the room and took it. They did not speak for a long time. The machines beeped their indifferent rhythms. The city outside the window was doing what cities do in the early morning, waking up, beginning again, indifferent to what had happened in this particular room. Eventually, Claudia said, quietly, without letting go of his hand, "I knew you were listening. About the second day. I could tell." Edward looked at her. "You got very still," she said. "Not the way unconscious people are still. The way you get still in a meeting when someone says something you're going to use later." A pause. "I've been watching you be still like that, my whole life." She looked down at their joined hands. "I kept talking anyway," she said, "in case I was wrong, and because I needed to say those things whether you heard them or not." She looked back up at him. "I chose not to tell the doctors, because I wanted you to decide when to come back, not Nathan. Not Stuart. You." Edward made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. "I have a lot to say to you," Claudia said. "When you can talk properly." "I know," Edward said. 2 words, rough and slow and entirely meant. He met with Nathan that afternoon. It was a short meeting. Edward could not yet sustain extended speech, and there was not much to say that the situation had not already said. Nathan sat in the chair where Claudia had spent 5 days and looked at his father with the expression of a man recalibrating in real time, updating his model of the situation with new information, the way Edward had taught him, the way it looked when there was no performance left to fall back on. Edward said, in the careful, measured sentences that were all his voice currently allowed, "I know about the subcontract. I know about the certification gaps. I know about Thursday's board meeting." A pause to gather the next words. "I also know things that have nothing to do with what you've done. Things I should have known 7 years ago and did not, because I built a system that made not knowing convenient." Nathan said nothing. "I'm not going to protect you from the consequences of the subcontract," Edward said. "What I will tell you is that the way you learned to make decisions like that, the logic of it, the structure of it, you learned from me. And I intend to spend whatever time I have left making sure it stops here." Nathan looked at him for a moment. Then he stood, picked up his jacket, and left without speaking. Edward did not know, watching him go, whether he had just lost his son or found him. He was not certain those were different things. The weeks that followed were full of documents and meetings and phone calls that each carried enormous weight and looked, from the outside, like ordinary administrative work. Frank Dillard was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours of Edward's discharge from Callaway Regional. The criminal referral followed 2 weeks later, after Edward's personal attorney presented the relevant documentation, including a copy of the original safety assessment that Frank had removed from the investigation file, located in a backup archive that Frank had apparently believed no longer existed. Edward had known the archive existed. He had not known what was in it. He had, 7 years ago, not asked. He asked now. The wrongful death case that Beverly's attorney had been building for 2 years was able to proceed with the restored documentation. Edward did not insert himself into the litigation. He made himself available when investigators needed information and answered their questions without qualification. He testified before the State Labor Safety Board in January, seated at a long table under fluorescent lighting in a room that smelled of carpet cleaner and institutional coffee. His voice recovered to something close to its normal register, but his hands still not entirely steady. The room was not large. There were perhaps 20 people present, most of them reviewing documents or typing notes. It was not the kind of room where significant things appeared to happen, and yet Edward understood, sitting in it, that the most significant moments of reckoning rarely looked the way you expected them to. He did not frame his testimony around what Frank Dillard had done without his knowledge. He framed it around the system he had built that had made it possible, the culture of resolution without accountability, the hierarchy of problems that had placed Deshaun Odums's life outside the category of things that required the boss's attention. The sentence quoted most widely in the coverage that followed was one he said in response to a question he had not anticipated when a board member asked whether he believed Frank Dillard had acted alone. Edward said, "Frank Dillard made the decision. I built the conditions that made the decision available to him. Those are different things. They are both true." Nathan's situation resolved through civil rather than criminal proceedings. 3 board members resigned. The subcontract was terminated. The bridge project was suspended pending a full safety audit conducted by an independent firm with no prior relationship with Marsh Construction. Edward did not return to the role of chief executive. He appointed an interim board, half internal, half external, with a mandate to review every active project's safety compliance within 90 days. He asked Claudia to serve as the board's independent observer, a role with no operational authority, but with full access to every document and meeting. She said yes after 24 hours, not hesitation. He understood, but consideration. She was deciding on the basis of the actual facts rather than the name on the letterhead. He had always said he wanted people around him who did that. He had rarely created the conditions for it. He told her this. She said she knew. She said she was glad he could see it now. He called Beverly's direct line at the hospital 3 weeks after his discharge. She answered on the 3rd ring. He identified himself. There was a brief silence. "I know why you're calling," she said. "I want to offer." "Mr. Marsh." Her voice was not hostile. It carried information without performance, the same voice she had used in his hospital room. "I've had 7 years of people offering things. Compensation. Settlements. Official expressions of regret." A pause. "What I want is for the process to move forward correctly. It's moving forward correctly. That's what I want you to know. I'm watching." Edward said, "That's fair." "Yes," she said. "It is." A silence. "Deshaun deserved better than what he got," Edward said. "I cannot give him that, but I can make sure the file is complete and the record is accurate, and it does not happen again on any project I have anything to do with. I intend to do that." Beverly was quiet for a moment. "Then do it," she said. "Every day. Not because it makes you feel better, because it's right." She ended the call. Edward sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after. The fund was established in March under the name of the Deshaun Odums Construction Safety Fellowship, a scholarship and training program for early career structural engineers with a focus on workers from communities historically underrepresented in the field. It was administered by an independent foundation with no board seats held by anyone associated with Marsh Construction. The announcement was issued by the foundation, not by Edward's office. He did not attend the press event. Beverly found out through her attorney. She did not call. 3 months later, she sent a brief email through her attorney's office. It contained no greeting and no signature. It said, "Deshaun would have applied for that. He would have been good at it." Edward read it once. He printed it and kept it in the drawer of his desk at home, not the office desk, the one in the room where Margaret's photograph still sat on the shelf, the desk where he occasionally found himself talking to that photograph the way Beverly talked to Deshaun's. He had thought, until recently, that this was a peculiarity he should stop. He no longer thought that. The community event was held on a Thursday evening in early May, at a training facility in the east quarter of the city, a neighborhood Edward's company had worked in and around for 15 years, without Edward ever having visited directly. The facility was new, built by a non-profit coalition that had cited the safety standards now embedded in Marsh Construction's project contracts as a model in their grant application. Edward had not been invited. He had read about the event in a newsletter and come anyway, which he understood was the right instinct expressed imperfectly, which seemed to be the best he could manage most days. He sat in the third to last row. Beverly was there with Andre, her nephew, 25 years old, who worked as an apprentice electrician. He had a way of standing that suggested a person who works with their hands and thinks carefully about what they make. Several people spoke: a safety coordinator from the city, 2 engineers who had come up through apprenticeship programs, A young woman who had completed the first cohort of what would become the Odom's Fellowship. She did not know, standing at that podium, that the man who had funded the program was in the third to last row, and Edward was glad she did not know, because her remarks were not about gratitude to a donor, and were therefore true in a way they might not have been. At the end of the evening, as people moved toward the exits, Andre said something to Beverly. Edward was close enough to hear it. "Does she forgive him?" Andre asked, low enough that only those nearby could hear. Beverly considered the question with the seriousness she brought to things worth considering. "I don't know," she said, finally. "I know he's doing the right thing. I know he's doing it consistently. I know Deshawn mattered enough to him now that he comes to things like this when nobody invited him." She paused. "Whether that's forgiveness or just watching, I'm still figuring that out." Andre said, "Is there a difference?" Beverly was quiet for a moment. "Ask me next year," she said. They moved toward the exit. Edward remained in his seat until the room had mostly cleared, then stood and helped two volunteers stack the chairs along the back wall, because there were chairs that needed stacking, and he was standing right there, and it was the kind of task that required no credential and no authority, just the willingness to do it. He drove home alone, taking the long way, through the East Quarter, through streets that bore his company's mark in the infrastructure beneath the surface, the water lines and conduit and foundation work that nobody sees but that everything above depends on. He thought about Deshawn Odoms, 31 years old, with a field notebook and a laugh that arrived early, who had noticed the things that mattered and had said so and had not been heard. He thought about Beverly, who had spent 7 years making sure Deshawn was not simply a closed file. He thought about Claudia, who had flown across the country to hold his hand and had told him she was not finished being angry at him and had meant both things completely. He drove until the city thinned into the edge where the construction sites accumulated the ongoing work, the future tense version of what the city was still becoming, and he stopped for a moment at the shoulder of the road and looked at the dark outlines of cranes against the sky. He thought about what it would mean to build something differently, not just with different materials or better specifications, but with the understanding that the people doing the building were the point, not the product of it. That a structure was only as sound as the attention paid to the people inside it during construction. He had known this as an engineering principle for 40 years. He was learning it now as something else. He pulled back onto the road and drove home. He did not make any promises to himself. He had made enough promises in his life to understand that a promise, by itself, was only the declaration of an intention, and that intention, without the daily practice of examining whether you were living up to it, was indistinguishable from the choice to not ask. He would ask. Every day. He would ask what he was missing, who he was not seeing, what the people around him knew that he had not yet thought to find out. He would keep asking long after it became uncomfortable. That was the only thing he had learned. In a hospital bed, in a building he had built, that he was certain was true.